This is part two of a conversation between me, Mike Vlahos, and Colonel Douglas Magcregor. And the second part of our conversation addresses the question of why NATO is failing so badly at a strategic level, and the extent to which this has become a proxy war that has galloped out of control, because it is a proxy war run on deceit and denial. And this would seem to be unimaginable in the sense that the narrative entering into this war was that Russia, and specifically Mr. Putin, were an expression of pure evil, and that America was seizing the leadership that it had so divinely grasped, the reins of the good, if you will, in World War II. And yet what we see actually is that the United States and its NATO allies, especially Britain, have engaged in a war of propaganda and deception. And of course, this is constituted essentially distributing Ukrainian propaganda, which understandably wants to ensure victory, and that, of course, its greatest hope would be to suck NATO into direct confrontation with Russia. And yet, the United States and Britain primarily have engaged in a larger propaganda war, both to aid Ukrainian propaganda. At one point, there were at least 250 public relations firms working for the Ukrainian government, helping it to get its message out. But also, the U.S. intelligence community has organized an entire ecology of Twitter users and others on social media to not only push out the Ukrainian message, but to actually obscure what is going on the ground. And American government officials have engaged in a kind of deception effort that one could only assume, knowing its dimensions, of being deliberate and deliberately orchestrated. And the question is, why would the U.S. do that? And more pointedly, and flowing from this effort to portray the war in a light that constitutes nothing less than sheer fantasy, what does this say about the American government and its military's ability to actually engage in actual reality? In other words, to conduct a net assessment that deals with things as they are and not as we wish them to be. And I guess that may be too overarchingly broad a question for you, Colonel, but it nonetheless has to be addressed. I mean, the U.S. Across the entirety of this war has represented what is going on falsely. Why is that? And what does it say about us?
Yeah. Well, I think we do have to understand, just to some extent, how much the NATO alliance has evolved over the last 50, 60 years. I mean, keep in mind that the alliance that emerges in the 1950s and 60s has a predetermined, unambiguous enemy to point to.
Right.
That begins to fall apart by the time you get into the 80s.
Right.
And at the end of 89, it vanishes. And long before we came to the realization that the Soviet state apparatus and its armed forces and its control of Eastern Europe was not quite what it was represented to be, the Europeans understood that far, far quicker. The Germans, I think, the Austrians, who were not in the alliance, but they're nevertheless a co-participant in Central East Europe. And I think the Swedes and Danes and others saw that Russia was failing. And there was an understanding that there probably wouldn't be a war.
Right.
Then the decision has to be made, what do we do with this thing called NATO? I mean, alliances are difficult to hold together in a war. And, you know, if you're trying to hold an alliance together in peacetime, it's much more difficult. But one of the things you do is you create an enemy for it. And we went through this in the 1990s of if NATO is either out of area or out of business. And I was on active duty and I heard these things in 95 in connection with Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I began to hear people in the Clinton administration talk about, well, we're beginning a democratic revolution in the Balkans. And this revolution will ultimately sweep all the way to Moscow. Of course, I thought they were certifiable. And so did many of the European officers. But unfortunately, there were many Europeans in positions of authority in government that seemed to believe that this sort of thing was going to happen. And that you would get the Urals to the Atlantic on American terms.
Right.
And as a result, we end up with this strange situation where NATO is no longer truly a defensive alliance,
Right.
but becomes an offensive instrument in the hands of Washington. Now, there's another reason for that, and this is what Americans don't understand. There is no command, control, communications, computer, C4SR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance backbone. There is no command structure with all the supporting assets that is European.
Right.
It is all American.
Right.
Anything that happens in Europe militarily is of necessity American, because if you take that backbone away,
Yeah.
no one can replace it. Now, the Europeans volunteered for this set of circumstances. They were only too willing to make them vassals of the United States. One way to think of Europe and the United States is to compare the Greek city-states to Rome.
Yes. Yes.
The Greek city-states invited the Roman legions to come in and rid them of a Macedonian king they didn't like, and then ultimately the Roman state. Now, in truth, the Greeks and the Romans did manage to get along reasonably well, but that was effectively the end of Greek dominance in any sense of the word, militarily or politically or economically.
You're describing an interesting evolution of empire. And of course, as you point out, NATO was an alliance.
Mm-hmm.
It was preeminently and visibly a military alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And the Soviet threat, quote unquote, was a real threat.
Mm-hmm.
And the overarching dominance of the U.S. in the recent war, World War II, was seen as the ultimate security blanket. And then in the wake, and you bring this up in a very powerful way, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO's raison d'etre all but evaporated. And your comment helps to explain why the U.S. didn't make a more concerted effort to bring the former states of the Soviet Union all together, including the Russian Federation, into NATO. And in fact, found a way to begin to reposition Russia objectively as a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes, a new enemy. And I think you also pointed out why this happened, because the distracting wars in the former Yugoslavia and the Middle East, in which NATO found itself paradoxically and strangely engaged in the middle of Central Asia, didn't continue to keep the bonds of dependency strong. In fact, it began to weaken them. And NATO, I think, its very cohesion.
Well, you had one other event that tended to reinforce American dominance and control, and that, of course, was the 1991 Gulf War.
Yes.
People looked at that and said, clearly, there's no one in the world that has access to the technology and the capabilities of the United States. And so I remember, I think it was Time or Newsweek that had a headline that showed American soldiers in the desert and said, where will they go next? And of course, within no time, you have Madeleine Albright,
Yes.
who meets with General Powell and says, you keep talking about this great army, well, why can't we use it? And of course, Powell's view was, well, that's a last resort. American military power is not the first resort, but the last resort.
Right.
And we were transformed at that point into kind of a 9/11 force.
Yeah.
That wherever the political leadership decided to send us, we would go and somehow or another muddle through and make things right. Well, that hasn't worked out very well.
No, I mean, we became, you call it a light infantry ethos, but it was really, in terms of its employment and deployment, a kind of SWAT team military.
Yes.
And during that period, the U.S. dominance was so great that European militaries began to slough off the things that made them credible as militaries.
Yes.
I mean, the French stopped conscription, for
Yes.
example. Germany's tank park is down to 200 tanks. The Netherlands gave up all of its tanks. So you have a kind of devolution into vestigial NATO militaries that aren't even like the old legions of the Roman Soci, the Roman allies. They're not equivalent in any way. They're sort of like accessories. to
Yes,
the
no,
US.
that's right. And the bad news is that having transformed themselves into effectively vassal states,
Yes.
they are no longer in a position where they once were. If you go back to someone like Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, he was in Key West talking to
It was a
JFK
terrible moment.
about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then later on, JFK talked to him about the potential for Vietnam. And Macmillan said, out of the question. We won't participate in that. This changes, and
Right.
Britain becomes a true vassal state, as opposed to, admittedly, once a great power, but still a force to be reckoned with, to the point where we would actually listen
Right.
to good advice.
You know, the British had the life, in a way, kicked out of them because you had Suez and Anthony Eden, where Eisenhower basically pulled the leash on
Yeah.
Britain and France. But that was followed again by this critical Key West meeting where Macmillan was humiliated because the U.S. had sucked Britain into replacing its deterrent delivery from the Blue Steel bomb to the advanced Skybolt, which was an airborne ballistic missile. And of course that just got canceled. This was a boondoggle program. And so Macmillan had to come hat in hand to the Bahamas and beg for Polaris missiles. And that was a real blow to Britain. And I think the real blow came later when the British abandoned their east of Suez. And most people forget the fact that in 1966, in the face-off between the new Malaysia and Indonesia, the British had over 60,000 troops and a fleet with 3 carriers, and it was a kind of a magnificent force. And that was the last major deployment, imperial deployment, but also deployment that gave the British the kind of place in the hierarchy where they could be the sidekick of the U.S. in an important way. And they tried symbolically, like in Desert Storm, they had the Desert Rats there. Then they had a division in southern Mesopotamia during the Iraq War. None of these gave the British enough cred. And so I think your term vassal state, which is used more and more increasingly around town, is an essential term to use, just as American empire is essential. Because when you have an empire, it's not about how much the imperial center administers its colonies. It doesn't have to be about colonies at all. It's about the relationship between the imperial center, the imperial court, and its client states. And when you're a vassal state, you are completely dependent upon and at the mercy of the imperial center.
However, the empire does occasionally strike back.
Yes.
And we now have lots of little states in Europe that
Right.
have joined this thing called NATO
Right.
that are very interested in leveraging American power,
Right.
military, political, economic, for their narrow interests.
Yeah.
A wonderful example of that, of course, is Poland.
Poland
And I would say Lithuania, that sits next door.
and Estonia and Latvia. I mean, these are tiny countries.
But they
Not
all,
Poland, but the
yeah,
Baltics are.
but they all have an agenda.
They do indeed.
And we have never sat down and clearly understood that those agendas are not necessarily our agendas. That we like these people and we want to do business with these people. And if they are attacked, we're happy to defend or help defend these people. And we know that they will fight. That's not up for discussion. The problem is we don't want to be dragged into any aspirational operations such as the Poles in Ukraine.
On the other hand, these countries are all the more loyal to us, the more dependent they become. and their very dependency becomes an excuse for elevating the threat. And the recreation of the Russian threat is in many ways essential to preserving the absolute dominance, even supremacy, of the American empire called NATO. And it is still, however, paradoxical why we would be so intensely focused, not simply on using Russia and the Russian threat as a way to keep NATO completely under our thumb, but actually going so far as to embrace the idea of Russian evil to the point where we will overextend ourselves, as we have, in this dangerous proxy war. And I'm wondering, what thoughts do you have on why the U.S. would go so far out on a limb, get so emotionally hysterical, especially among what I call the blue elites in the Imperial Court, the current administration?
Yeah. Well, remember, we're not talking about the American people.
Right.
They haven't been asked about any of this.
Right.
We don't consult them, and frankly, most of them don't care. So we have to do exactly what you've just done and be very specific about the well-financed minorities here in the capital,
Yes,
who are pursuing these things. And by the way, your overextension and the same kinds of dangerous implications apply to Asia. And we're not looking carefully at those either. Now, I think it's useful to consider the following. I think that we don't understand the extent to which we are overextended, first of all.
right.
There's a wonderful chapter written by Corelli Barnett in The Collapse of British Power. It's called Covenants Without Swords.
Yeah.
And he explains how in the 20s and the 30s, the British began making all of these commitments around the world for which they had no forces to sustain. He said, so they end up going to war in 1939, completely unprepared for the global implications and the commitments, and they never really come to terms with it. So what they do is impoverish themselves by relying exclusively on us to bankroll them. We not only bankroll them, we equip them. And so it's the first step on the road to vassal state status.
Yeah.
And that begins during World War II. I think it was by the end of 41 or the beginning of 42, the British were effectively bankrupt. They had nothing left.
They're bankrupt, and they'd also managed to get themselves in threat situations in 3 theaters against Japan, Italy in the Mediterranean, and then Germany. And before that, during the Winter War in Finland, the French and the British were ready to bomb the Soviet Union,
Yeah, of course.
which would have consolidated a Nazi-Soviet Eurasia along with Japan and China.
Absolutely.
And yet they were willing to do that for what?
Well,
This gets down, because this is very much like the U.S. today, I think.
Well, this is also where you need a strategic reassessment in the sense that I hear people all the time, well, what about we want America to be first, and you don't sound to me like you want to be an American first guy. You want to be an American last guy. And I said, well, why do you say that? Well, you don't really want to go out there and confront these evil people. And so I said, there's something to be said for hanging back and letting your potential opponent overextend himself. Right now, we've done the opposite. We've overextended ourselves. We're actually a very fragile grip on all the things that we think we control. We see that in the finance markets. We see it economically. We don't produce in this country as we once did. We're not even defending our borders, and yet we're courting outright war in a part of the world where most Americans have never been and don't even understand.
Well, let's unpack that, because this is something that I don't think is come together as a set of relational dynamics driving America to the situation in the past that it's in today. And I think one of those has to be a over-assessment, a mixture of complacency, arrogance, vanity, entitlement, a belief that the American military is supreme, so that it is not only the sharpest arrow in your quiver, it's also the element that never fails. And what strikes me as ironic and mysterious is the fact that it's failed again and again, since the 1960s, and yet somehow are entranced by our own symbols of power and continue to use them in part because we have such faith in their talismanic power, their ability to keep us strong. How did that happen, if you want to just sum that up? Because that's an important long-term secular trend.
I think there's a perception that the American military has never been defeated,
Right.
which of course is misleading, if not outright wrong.
Well, Harry Summers said that was never defeated in battle
Yes.
in
yeah.
Vietnam. Yeah.
Yet we found it impossible to win the war.
Right.
So I think I think that has to be re-examined. There are various ways you win and lose, and this goes back to the attrition model we were discussing before. You can expend all your resources and be defeated not by the enemy, but by your own stupidity. That, I think, is what's happening to some extent in Ukraine, although admittedly I think the Russians are doing far more what's right than what's wrong. I think we're not even in the game. We're not even considering these things. We're not looking at any of our potential vulnerabilities. We only see what we believe to be strengths, but those strengths in many cases haven't recently been tested. And if you fight someone like Russia, those things will be tested. And this is also something that I hope we would talk a little bit about. This is some of the work that you've done on identity.
Yeah.
Where if I see anything, I see a stronger Russia, a more cohesive societal structure in Russia.
Right.
Greater faith and confidence in the Russian state and in Russian nationalism. And I don't see that happening in Europe. In fact, this is the problem with this NATO alliance. There are diverging interests. People in Berlin are looking at what's going on in Poland and have concluded the Poles have lost their minds. They're not interested in being part of a war in Russia. I don't know of anybody in Italy or Greece or France or Spain that's interested in being dragged into a war with Russia.
This is a really pertinent question that takes us to the heart of how our worldview has become so distorted. And I think part of it is structural in the sense of what happens to an imperial court-centric ruling class and ruling system. And part of it is the loss of insight that goes along with that process of becoming, a navel-gazing courtier class. And in America, ever since the Clinton administration, but including all those that came after, with the possible exception of Mr. Trump, has seen the rise of a global elite, championing words like globalization, gathering by the hundreds in their private jets at Davos every January, and increasingly separate and cut off from the pulse of the actual nation of the American people.
Well, of course, this was exactly Corelli Barnett's argument.
Yes.
That the British ruling classes had this vision of England, primarily, that didn't exist anymore, that had vanished as a result of the First World War. And we have a similar situation right now. If you ask the ruling elites here about America, they wax eloquently about America. Well, have you visited it lately? I talked to someone the other day who insisted that, this inflation isn't all that bad and we can master this and get by. And I said, drive 100 miles west, 100 miles north, or 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., and go to the food banks and look at the lines of people in the food banks waiting to be fed. I said, things are not good. But this same sort of disconnect is there. But we, unlike Great Britain, don't have the United States that's going to march in and supplant what we don't have with their capabilities.
Well, this is a powerful aspect about this ruling class and this ruling class ethos of globalization. Is that on one hand, again, since Clinton all the way up to 2016 at the very least, and then again after 2020, there has been this almost conscious deindustrialization of the U.S. In other words, during those administrations, the U.S. actively allowed 50% of our manufacturing base to move to China. Some of it to Mexico, but it changed the balance in the global economy. And they don't care about borders. In fact, they want more cheap labor in the U.S. And they have a ruling ethos that is not really connected to the preceding ethos, which was the American ethos, which was a more unitary, if hardly monolithic, but more unitary concept of the nation. They don't have a concept of the nation. They have a concept of a world elite class. And what that does is it puts them and their worldview in a context where they use the word identity as a political cudgel. And identity to them is just another tactic in their attempt to seize and control power. Actual identity, as in the old nation, is something that exists in Russia, and it's extremely powerful. But they have lost the capacity to understand the existence of that identity. They can only see it as something to be expunged somehow.
Well, the sad part is our European contemporaries, our colleagues in all of those governments have gleefully participated in the systematic deindustrialization of their societies and the destruction of national identity.
Except for Hungary.
Yeah, with the exception of Hungary. And I would say also with the exception, interestingly enough, of the Poles.
Oh, yeah.
But
That's
the,
true.
the thing, though, is that, and dare I mention his name, who is normally viewed as the Antichrist inside the Beltway, and that's Donald Trump, who made the argument that the Europeans had to become their own first responders. It's a very simple statement. But being your own first responder automatically translates into some degree of sovereignty, independence, judgment, thought, strategy, all of which have been swept away through 50, 60 years of NATO.
Well, the humorist might say that Mr. Trump was offering effectively tough love and essentially saying, you don't want to be a vassal? Here's what you have to do.
That's
you want to be your own actual nation? Here's what you have to do.
But there's also another part of this vision that's very important, and that is that we see the world as this multipolar place.
Yeah.
And that's not an unhealthy thing.
No.
And increasingly we see regions emerging, regional structures, regional organizations, which is something Hedley Bull predicted many years ago in the 70s and the 60s. You can view that as positive, or you can see it as negative. Now, if you're an imperialist, you live in Versailles on the Potomac,
Right.
oh, that's terrible, because that means you no longer have control.
Yes.
And ultimately, it's our control which is the issue in this war with Russia.
Yeah, and we've paradoxically undone our control. The last levers we have are financial.
Yes.
And we've even undone and dismissed in the last couple of years energy,
Yes.
which is a very powerful lever.
Yes.
And we've let the military slide even in the last 2 years as well. Even the most ready and most revered sacred weapon in our quiver, we have let it rust.
Well, to some extent, one wonders if we're not similar to the Prussian army on its way to Jena, Auerstedt.
Oh yeah, and
They-
couldn't
they-
conceive of itself being
Exactly.
not the best.
They sort of maintained this relic as a tribute to the great achievements of Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. Didn't turn out to be very effective when it encountered the Grand Army under Napoleon. And I think that we fall into that category so
Right.
much, which leads us to how do we engage in a sobering self-assessment?
Well, if I could introduce the final chink, or the final piece that has come out as a chink in our situation, and that is that this this blue globalist elite, for want of a better descriptive term, has become itself dependent on its anger and hatred of Russia. And I think in large part this is a case of being hoist to your own petard. But the last thing we needed to do is get into a war with Russia. And yet somehow the political ploys that we've been talking about, that you mentioned, of re-ensnaring NATO, restitching their vassal status by using Russia, at some point got out of hand. You could say it was 2014 after. It still sort of hasn't tipped over. But I think what we saw in 2016 with the emergence of this mythology of the Russian bacterium, that it was infecting our body politic, and it was evil, with metaphorical examples like the infection that are similar to what we did with the communists, also to the Nazis. What it did, it created a kind of emotional imbalance. You might even want to sort of compare it to a psychosis in which our judgment has been degraded.
Oh, absolutely.
Our strategic judgment. So when you ask the question of why don't we step back and see things as they really are, and reassess our situation and take remedial steps, we're admired in our own emotion. I say this because I listen to all of these people in Congress, the writers, the people in the mainstream media, and they really believe what they're saying. So this, to me, might help to explain why the elite has created this fantasy about the war and stuck so doggedly to it and attacked so relentlessly anyone who tried to bring up a criticism or different analysis.
Well, there's no doubt that this war on an ideological level is inextricably intertwined
Yes.
with all of the other misconstrued ideas and confused mindsets that you're mentioning. I don't know that there's an easy solution, but something's going to happen in the near future.
Right.
This is going to collapse. This narrative is going to fail. It's just like all these supposed Russian atrocities. And many of us have looked at these accusations and allegations and found wanting.
Right.
They just don't hold up. On the other hand, the Ukrainian forces have done some very terrible things.
Just regular Ukrainians to other Ukrainians.
Yes.
Over the last 8 years.
Yeah, and so this is all going to collapse. And the question is, when it collapses, will we be able to do what you just described, step back? Now, there's one thing working in our favor, and that is that more and more Americans are saying, you want to march into Ukraine with 40,000 troops,
Right.
and 30,000 Polish troops, and 20,000 Romanian troops? What's wrong with our borders? Why don't we protect our borders? What are we doing for our own national security? This is a legitimate question, and it's beginning to come up more and more. People are not happy with the situation.
Well, in our conversation, I think we've come to an interesting discovery. That is that if you have a courtier class that is in control at this point of the imperial court and is giving orders to the American military that run the risk of a further escalation out of proxy war into direct actual war, then this is, as it were, the kind of hinge of fate that we have to face. And in many ways, it suggests that military leaders at some point will have to say no for us not to get into a dangerous situation. And I think there have been some tiny hints of that with Milley.
Well, my classmate, Ray Odierno, who
Yeah.
passed away not long ago, when he was chief of staff, she said, I hear people telling us to do more with less. He said, why can't we do less with less? And it's a legitimate question, and that was about as far as he was willing to go. I wish he'd gone further, but it's true. And it's back to covenants without swords. We have a shrinking military establishment. We have a military establishment right now, which for a whole range of reasons, a lot of people don't want to serve in. And then we have 30 years of senior officer selection that have led to a group of senior leaders
Yes.
that, frankly, most of us on any normal day would not follow, even out of idle curiosity.
I know.
They don't have any gut-wrenching experiences in their background. They don't exhibit professional depth.
I've taught many of them.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, then it's partially your fault, I guess.
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
My point is that we seem to have preferred people that were anxious to go along. Oh yes, of course, if that's what you want, that's your new policy. We'll support it, whatever it is. Just promote me.
The key, and the reason I'm responding here is that apart from my culpability, there is a larger culpability in the military education system which reflects a sclerosis of thinking. In the 186-page syllabus of the strategy and policy course at the Naval War College, the word critical thinking was used 100 times. And yet, all you had to do to ace that course was just get all of the correct answers that were in the 186 pages. And it was effectively a formula, just as all of the little stratagems, I won't call it strategy because it's been stratagems, like counterinsurgency, have been formula. And the formula doesn't work because it's self-serving and self-satisfying. And it strikes me that when this big offensive occurs, now, so let's tie this to the military picture that we addressed in the first part. And Americans have been so misled, and the fantasy, the souffle of heady aromas that have infused the elite will suddenly collapse. And at that point, there will be those who want to dramatically escalate, like the neocons, and like the most neoliberal blues and blue courtiers. And so that will, I think, be the moment of great danger in this entire war. And that'll be the moment when the military leadership's going to have to step up. The problem is, bringing in military education again, is that the entire point in the War College course that I taught all those years was to accommodate and appease civilian leadership in return for autonomy and control and money to preserve your lifestyle.
Yes.
That's not a healthy relationship when you're on the cusp of World War III.
No, I think so. And you know, I served in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff, and one of the things that I could never find was a clear statement of U.S. vital strategic interests.
Right.
Which one would look for as the justification for force structure, contingency planning, and so forth. Instead, you had these vague things. Well, we may have to fight 2 near simultaneous conflicts. And then we might have to fight one and then something else, maybe.
A lesser contingent.
And on and on and on. But there was no, these are the things important. You know, go back to World War II, and I think this has been a problem for us for a long time. If you go back to General Marshall and his meetings with the British that begin actually before the war is declared privately, but then during the war, these conferences in Morocco and Tehran and so forth, we would walk in and there would be 12 officers or 10 officers with Marshall, and the British would walk in and all of their officers were carrying map cases and books of papers and things. And the British would roll out these maps and show where every oil field was located, where every port was located, where every rail line. We had nothing. And so they said, well, what are you doing? We're defeating Germany. We're defeating Japan. What do you want this to look like when the war's over? What do you want out of this? What do we want the world to look like? I mean, the British were thinking about those things. Of course, they're imperialists. They've been at this for hundreds of years. But we learned almost nothing from this. Well, we're still lost.
If we are chosen by God to be His agent to redeem humanity, why should we look at anyone else? But I think, you know, again, you raise another missing piece here, which is, if you look at World War II, we didn't have, like in the 70s or 80s, a 1.5 war strategy or 2 war strategy. We had a 6 war strategy. We fought at least 6 wars: China, Burma, India, Southwest Pacific, the Navy in the Pacific, the Battle of the Atlantic, the war in Italy, and then the war, the North German plain. And we did it because we had everything. We had limitless everything.
Almost limitless.
Well,
there were still limits. We don't admit to them.
No, but we produced 80,000 combat aircraft in 1944. We gave thousands and thousands of aircraft to the Russians, et cetera, et cetera.
But remember, there was a letter that was sent from Marshall to Eisenhower. And he said, look, you've got all the divisions you're going to get. This is in January, in the midst of the bulge.
90, yeah.
You know, you've got to fight this thing and win it. You're not going to get anything else. We can't do it.
Yeah.
We have all these other commitments, so get on with it and win the war. Well, it was an interesting letter, and
it's powerful.
But it was very important for Eisenhower. And this is something, and I'm not here to discuss whether he was a great president, a bad president. That's another issue entirely. But he did come to the presidency with a very acute sense of just how limited our resources really were and our manpower. And he saw the Second World War through a very different lens from, say, Kennedy or Nixon, who were in the fleet in the Pacific and were starry-eyed and amazed at the masses of ships and everything else. Didn't understand that it all came at a cost.
This is a super point. And the fact that we had, again, using the Clausewitz nugget of, the culminating point of attack. We'd reached the culminating point of attack against Japan.
Yes.
I don't know that we could have pulled off the invasion of Japan or accepted as a nation, the millions of casualties we would have
Well, this is your point on Okinawa that is not widely
Right.
appreciated.
Well, we lost 100,000 casualties on Okinawa and Iwo Jima together, and that's what the Japanese lost. And in other words, they lost fewer. They weren't dead, but to us, it was the casualties that mattered. And the fact is, that was a lesson that Eisenhower absorbed, but generations after him, especially as you pointed out, the best and the brightest who started VM, they never imbibed that, and even less so, the feckless generations that are now the courtiers at the imperial court.
So when you're talking today about the terrible possibility that we might send this coalition of the willing from Poland
Right.
some distance into Ukraine, which was described by General Petraeus,
Yes.
there is an acute failure to understand what that really means. How many replacements do you have standing behind these forces to replace the wounded? Because you have to assume that the Russians are not going to sit there and ignore the presence of this force in front of them. How many repair parts? How much fuel? How many days of ammunition? We just go down the list. I don't think we've sat down and done the calculus.
Well, this may be the final point of America's strategic weakness and inflexibility, and that is the holy narrative of World War II. And one thing that I'm getting, not just out of the memories of my father's generation talking about the war that were passed on, but also the way in which so much of the rhetoric coming from the blue elite and the mainstream media has tried to recreate the emotional sort of uplift, the emotional high that we had in World War II and afterwards. Almost as though the World War II experience is the thing that we really want to get out of this war, and we thought we could do it on the cheap. And I think one of the reasons the elites rushed to embrace this war is that suddenly the prospect opened up, or rose up,
Yes.
of another ecstatic realization. World War II for the American people was an ecstatic realization. War can do that.
Yes.
War can do the opposite, as we see in World War I.
Yes.
But the ecstatic realization is what the Washington blue courtier elite desperately wanted. They wanted somehow to be the lineal descendants of the people who fought World War II. That is what unnerves me about the coming weeks.
Here's a thought that may end up being a useful sort of conclusion.
Yeah.
Just before we went into Iraq in 2003, and I had a modest role in that by being asked to design an approach that would, at that point in time, get us in and then facilitate a rapid withdrawal.
Right.
Of course, that all changed, but that's another story. But I was watching all the preparations, and there were discussions about these forces are deploying and so forth. And a woman was interviewed in Washington, D.C., who lived in a not very nice neighborhood.
Yeah.
And she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, well, I sure wish the U.S. Army would come to my neighborhood and occupy it and get rid of all these drug dealers and criminals.
Wow.
And here we are preparing to move 6,000 miles away to deal with something that in retrospect was, in strategic terms, a pimple.
Yeah.
And at home, what has happened? She was right.
Yeah.
She made an excellent point. And I think that ultimately more and more Americans will come to that conclusion, and it may be the American electorate that rises up and saves us.
Well, the correlation, if you will, between the domestic upheaval and conflict in the U.S. and the fecklessness and yet absolute danger of this imbroglio in Ukraine is, I think, the most salient and urgent issue for Americans to enjoin.
And then I think in the final analysis, what we need to take from all of this is the understanding of this paradigm shift in warfare.
Yeah.
This is the ISR strike connectivity.
Let's get to that then in part 3.
Okay.